This is Harsh Rules. I'm Ben Harsh, and today we're going to learn to play Axis and Allies Revised Edition. Axis and Allies the Revised Edition was released in 2004 by Avalon Hill and designed by Larry Harris Jr. and Mike Selinker. This game supports 2 to 5 players and takes 6 or more hours to play. Before we begin this episode, I'd like to recognize the Harsh Rules Patreon supporters that help make content like this possible. If you'd like to support the channel, head over to patreon.com/harshrules to learn more. And once again, thank you for your support. Another way you can support the channel is by liking and subscribing. Liking a video helps me understand what content is successful with this audience. As for subscribing, new content appears on this channel first. While you may have found your way here from Board Game Geek or other sites, in the future I'll also be adding more exclusive content that may only be found here. The best way to be informed when I upload new videos is to subscribe and click the bell icon for notifications. Once again, thanks for watching, and now let's get to the video. In Axis and Allies Revised Edition, each game round is comprised of players taking their turn in a set order of play. The Soviet Union takes their turn first, then Germany, the United Kingdom, Japan, and finally the United States. Once all players have taken their turn, a check for victory is made. If no player has met the game's victory conditions, another game round is played through, and so on. Each player's turn follows a 7-part action sequence. In Phase 1, they may attempt to develop weapons. Next, they purchase units. These units are considered under construction and set aside until later in the turn. After that, the player conducts all unit movement that will result in combat. Then they resolve all those instances of combat. Next, the player conducts all non-combat movement. After that, they may place the new units they've purchased on the game board. Finally, they will collect income based on the total production value of the territories they control. Now that you have an overview of a game round, let's look at each step of the action sequence in greater detail. In the first phase of a player's turn, they may invest in research for a chance to upgrade their weapons. There are 6 advancements that players can attempt to discover. Jet fighters that allow their fighters to defend on a 5, rockets that can be used to reduce industrial production, super submarines that attack on a 3, long-range aircraft technology that allow fighters a range of 6 and bombers a range of 8, combined bombardment that allow destroyers to conduct a one-shot attack during an amphibious assault, and finally, heavy bombers that allow players to roll 2 dice in an attack or a strategic bombing raid. To develop these weapons, first players must choose which development they're aiming for. Then they may buy research dice at a cost of 5 IPCs each. Any number of these dice can be purchased, but they can only be used once. Then the player rolls their research dice, and if they roll the number of the advancement they're aiming for, they achieve the technology. They then mark their progress on the weapon's development chart with a control marker. When gaining these weapon advances, remember any number of powers may develop the same weapons, but powers cannot share their technology amongst each other. To complete the purchase units phase, players will need the right side of their reference card. For the first game round, each player has already collected their starting income based on the printed emblems on the national production chart. Now in Phase 1, the player taking their turn will decide whether to purchase new military units with their IPCs. As we saw before, the player reference chart shows each unit's cost in a military unit table. To the right of this are the unit's stats. Movement refers to the number of spaces that unit may move on the game map. Typically, land units can only move across territories. Naval units across sea zones. Air units can cross both types. Attack and defense ratings refers to the game's combat. Combat is resolved with 6-sided dice. To score a hit on the enemy, a unit must roll its attack or defense rating or less. The rating to use is determined whether that unit is attacking into a territory or defending a territory it controls. Once a player has purchased their units, they place them on a space in the lower left-hand corner of the game board. This space indicates that those units are under construction. In Phase 5, construction will be completed and they will be ready to be placed on the game board. With a combat move, players can only advance units that will end in a territory or C-zone containing enemy units that then triggers combat. Although there are several units in the game, most units have the same movement range. All land units can move 1 territory space, with the exception of the tank, which can move 2 spaces. Naval units can move up to 2 sea zones. As for air units, fighters can move 4 spaces and bombers can move 6 spaces. However, air movement is broken into 2 parts. Part of their movement is used to reach a target in the combat moves phase, but they also must have enough movement left over to reach a safe landing zone in the non-combat moves phase. And invading air units cannot use the targeted territory as their landing zone. Therefore, it's good etiquette to declare a flight plan to your opponent when conducting air unit combat moves. To assist in aircraft movement, the revised edition comes with numbered markers to plot a path through territories. For new players, this is a good way to keep track of air units' range, as well as establish a path to determine obstacles like anti-aircraft guns. Next, let's discuss some unique situations regarding combat-related movement. First, land units may perform a capture move when entering an undefended territory. An extension of this is the armored unit's blitz move. This allows them to capture an undefended territory and then proceed into an adjacent territory from that. If the next territory is occupied by enemy forces, they can then engage them in combat. Naval units have the ability to conduct an amphibious assault. This allows escorted transports to unload troops on enemy beaches and conduct combat. We'll review an example of how this works in just a moment. Air units may conduct strategic bombing raids on enemy industrial complexes to inflict economic loss. We'll look at an example for this as well. Finally, an important note about air unit movement. Anti-aircraft guns may fire at air units passing over their territory. Each anti-aircraft gun is allowed 1 die roll per air unit passing over. However, only 1 anti-aircraft gun per territory can fire. If the die result is a 1, then it scores a hit on the air unit. With multiple air units, the player moving them gets to decide which unit is the casualty. And the planes that are eliminated have no chance to counterattack. Keep these rules in mind when moving air units. Now, while on the subject of movement, let's talk about transports. Transports are valuable because they can load units from 1 territory, then move up to 2 sea zones and unload those units in another territory. Be aware though, unloading units prevents further movement. Therefore, a transport cannot move 1 sea zone, unload units, and then move again. When a transport hauls units, they're treated like cargo and cannot conduct combat while aboard. A transport may haul 2 infantry units or an infantry unit and 1 from the following list: an anti-aircraft gun, an artillery unit, or an armor unit. During this step of the player turn, transports may only unload into enemy territory. This action is known as an amphibious assault. All other loading and unloading is conducted during the non-combat move step of the player turn. In Axis and Allies Revised Edition, friendly units on the same side may share a transport. However, these units must board a friendly transport during their turn. The transport, with the units aboard, moves on the owner's turn. Then, the friendly units on board unload on their nation's next turn. When these units load and unload, it counts as their full movement for the turn. Therefore, only units from the same country may load and unload on the same turn. Also, transports may not load or unload to each other. And finally, there may be situations where transports start a turn in a sea zone with enemy ships. When this occurs, they may not load or unload units. However, they may move out to a friendly or empty sea zone. From there, if a territory is available, they may then load and unload. Next, let's take a look at the amphibious assault. Amphibious assaults allow an attacking player to conduct a beach landing. However, the nature of the landing is dependent on the opponent's defenses. If the defending player's territory has naval units on its shoreline, then a standard naval battle must be fought first. Since units can only conduct one battle per turn, the attacking player must decide whether air units will participate in the naval battle or wait and support the beach landing. Also remember that units on transports cannot attack in a naval battle. These units are sitting ducks until they land on the beach. If the shoreline is not defended, then battleships may conduct an offshore bombardment. Destroyers can also participate if the player has upgraded their technology. Each battleship may fire one shot to support the landing. They score a hit on a 4 or less. If destroyers have been upgraded, they also receive one shot each and hit on a 3 or less. Once offshore bombardment is complete, surviving transports unload on the beach and with any available air support, conduct land combat to try and take the territory. Once the active player has completed all their combat moves, it's time to resolve each area of conflict on the map one at a time with the battle board. Each battle is completed in combat rounds of 8 steps. Let's begin with step 1. To conduct a battle, remove all miniatures from the contested territory or sea zone. Then, place the miniatures on the battle board spaces by matching each unit type to its silhouette. The battle board organizes units sequentially by the die result that they can hit an enemy unit. Units may be better suited to an attack rather than a defense and vice versa, and some units cannot attack or defend at all. For example, transports that are part of an attacker's force have no attack rating and are placed on a special space on the battle board. In Axis and Allies, battles are intended to occur simultaneously. However, to facilitate this in a board game, they follow a sequence of steps. Each round of combat has a pre-attack event that recognizes a special unit ability. In land battles, this is the anti-aircraft gun. In naval battles, the submarine. Once these effects are resolved, the main battle begins. The attacker rolls their dice first. When the attacker scores hits, the defender selects casualties from their own forces and moves them to the casualty space. This space is a reminder that although these units will be eliminated at the end of the round, they still get to roll dice to fire back. Remember, although we're playing the battle in steps, it's all meant to happen simultaneously. Next, the defending player gets to roll dice for their units to fire back. For the hits that are scored, the attacker chooses their own casualties. Then both sides remove their casualties from the battle board. If all units on one side have been eliminated, then the player with units remaining on the battle board is the victor. However, if both sides still have units, then the attacker decides if he will press the attack and initiate another combat round, or elect to retreat, in which case the battle ends. If the attacker eliminates the defender, then they capture the territory. Now that you have an overview of how the battle works, let's walk through each step in greater detail. For this brief battle example, I'm going to pit a British infantry unit and artillery unit versus a German infantry unit and armor unit. Placing these units on the board, you can see the differences in their attack versus defense ratings. Since the attacker has an artillery unit paired with an infantry unit, they receive a combined arms bonus. Combined arms basically means that for every artillery unit brought into battle by an attacker, one infantry unit's attack rating is increased to 2. This pairing is on a 1-to-1 basis. Therefore, we move the attacker's infantry unit to the attack rating 2 space. Be aware though, combined arms is an attacking bonus. Defending artillery and infantry units do not receive this. Step 2 is dedicated to opening fire events. I've divided this step into 2 parts, one for land battles and one for naval battles. Step 2A is if the defender has an anti-aircraft gun. If they do, then they roll 1 die for each of the attacker's aircraft. No matter how many anti-aircraft guns are in a territory, the player only rolls 1 die per aircraft. For each die result of 1, an aircraft is shot down. The attacker gets to choose which of these aircraft are casualties. The strategic value of an anti-aircraft gun defense is that all aircraft that are shot down do not get to participate in the main battle. Step 2B is for naval battles with submarines. Submarines may usually fire before any other unit during each round of combat. This is called a first strike attack. However, this attack can only be used against naval units, not air units. To launch a first strike attack, roll 1 die for each attacking submarine. For every die result of 2 or less that is rolled, the defender suffers a hit. Units that are hit and eliminated are immediately removed from the battle board. They do not get a chance to fire back. However, battleships are allowed to take 2 hits before being sunk. Therefore, some players use battleships as shields to prevent other ships from being sunk. If the defending player has a destroyer in their fleet, this prevents the submarine's first strike ability. While submarines can still score a hit in this step, with a destroyer present, their targets are moved behind the casualty line and get a chance to fire back before being removed. Submarines also have an option to submerge instead of attacking. When the attacker decides to do this, they turn their submarine on its side. When submerged, a submarine may not attack or be attacked again during the turn. Next, remove the casualties from the opening fire actions. In Step 4, the attacking player fires with their units. They roll 1 6-sided die for each unit and attempts to roll that unit's attack rating or less. Each successful die result scores a hit on the enemy. The defender chooses which of his units will absorb these hits and moves them back to the casualty space. In Step 5, the defender gets to fire back. The defender rolls 1 die for each of his units, including those on the casualty space. The defender is trying to roll each unit's defense rating or less to score a hit on the attacker. The attacker chooses which of his units will absorb these hits. Then, in Step 6, all casualties are removed from the battle board. If no units remain on the attacker's side, then the defender wins. If the defender's forces are reduced until only anti-aircraft guns remain, then the attacker wins. Since anti-aircraft guns are emplacements, the attacker will then claim them as their own. If both the attacker and defender has units remaining in the battle, then the attacker must make a choice. They can choose to retreat and end the battle, or they can press the attack and complete another round of combat. If the attacker has eliminated all units with the exception of anti-aircraft guns and industrial complexes, they capture the territory. That player places a control marker in the territory space, and both players adjust their markers on the economic production chart by the production value shown in the territory. If the territory is a victory city, place a control marker on the victory city board to update each side's status to winning or losing the game. And that is how land and naval combat works with the battle board. Next, let's take a look at strategic bombing raids. Strategic bombing raids are economic attacks against an enemy industrial complex, allowing the attacker to destroy the IPCs of the enemy. In this version of Axis and Allies, only bombers may participate in strategic bombing raids. They must have enough range to reach an enemy industrial complex and return to a friendly territory. Strategic bombing raids are conducted in the following steps. Before the actual bombing begins, any anti-aircraft guns in the defending territory may fire first. Each die result of 1 scores a hit and removes a bomber. Bombers that survive anti-aircraft fire proceed to the next step. Then the bombing raid takes place. Surviving bombers each roll 1 die. The total rolled on the die, or dice, is the number of IPCs the defender must immediately surrender to the bank. If the owner of the bombed territory does not have enough IPCs to cover the penalty, the owner surrenders as many IPCs as he has. Then, during the non-combat movement sequence, attacking fighter planes and bombers that survived, then return to a friendly base within their movement range. With non-combat moves, players may move units to territories and sea zones that do not trigger combat. Land and naval units that moved during the previous combat moves phase may not move again. Air units divide their movement between both phases. Therefore, any air units that move to a target to conduct combat must now move again to a safe landing zone. Land units may be moved to any friendly territories occupied or unoccupied within their range. Anti-aircraft guns may also be moved into friendly territories during this time. However, anti-aircraft guns in territories captured during this turn may not be moved on the same turn. Naval units may be moved to any friendly sea zones occupied or unoccupied within their range. Transports moved to or already in sea zones next to friendly coastal territories may load or unload there. All naval units can travel through hostile sea zones if they're only inhabited by transports and submarines. Submarine units can travel through any sea zone if there are no destroyers. Destroyers nullify a submarine's ability to remain undetected. Fighters, but not bombers, may land on aircraft carriers. However, they may not land in territories that were just captured during the turn, and may not fly over neutral territories. Also, air units flying over countries with anti-aircraft guns may be fired upon in this version of the game. This phase also has a few other cleanup tasks to take care of. All submarines and battleships tipped on their sides from combat are now turned upright on the game board. This signifies that submarines have resurfaced and battleships are repaired to full strength again. At the beginning of the player turn, purchase units were placed on the space in the lower left-hand corner of the game board and considered under construction. In this phase, construction on those units is complete, and they may now be placed in territories containing industrial complexes that the player has controlled since the start of their turn. When placing new units, be aware that there are some restrictions. First, a player can only place a number of units up to the production value of the territory with the industrial complex. Also be aware that units cannot be placed in a friendly power's industrial complex unless that player's capital is in enemy hands. Place land units and bombers only in territories containing industrial complexes. These units cannot interplay on transports or aircraft carriers. However, fighters may interplay on newly built aircraft carriers. Place naval units in sea zones adjacent to industrial complexes. And new industrial complexes may be placed in a territory the player has controlled since the beginning of the turn and has an economic production value of at least 1. Remember, a player can only have 1 industrial complex per territory. In the last part of the player's turn, they check the national production chart and collect IPCs from the bank based on their nation's current economic production level. This is also a good opportunity for players to double-check their income by counting up the value of the territories they control. Be aware, though, if that nation's capital is under enemy control, they cannot collect income at this time. Also, a power cannot lend or give IPCs to another power even if both powers are on the same side. With those rules in mind, let's take a look at what happens during enemy occupation. Inevitably, during this game, a nation's capital is going to get occupied by the enemy. After a successful invasion, the occupier collects all of that nation's IPCs. The former owner of the capital is still in the game but cannot collect income from any territories he or she still controls, and they cannot buy new units nor research technologies until their capital is liberated. That player skips all phases except for combat moves, conducting combat and non-combat moves. If that player or one on its side liberates the capital, the owning power regains control of its original territories controlled by friendly powers. This includes use of its anti-aircraft guns as well as industrial complexes. The player then collects income from territories controlled in the power's next collect income phase after its capital was liberated. At the end of the round, after all 5 powers have taken a turn, check to see if either side has achieved the victory conditions set at the start of the game. Remember, minor victory equals 8 victory cities, a major victory 10 victory cities, and total victory all 12 victory cities. If a side controls enough victory cities to achieve the predetermined victory condition, they win the war. Otherwise, start a new game round and continue the conflict. And now, at this point in the tutorial, you should be ready to begin your own game of Axis and Allies, the Revised Edition. Once you're ready for more, in the next episode of this series, we will look at national advantages. These advanced optional rules add nation-specific features to the game, such as new technologies, special tactics, and historical events. If you found this video helpful, please give me a like and share with your friends. To be the first notified when the next episode of Harsh Rules becomes available, please hit the bell icon for notifications. And as always, this has been Harsh for Harsh Rules. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.